Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. With the return of Kata Classic, it brought back a lot of memories for me with healing. This is the first expansion that I ever healed in, and while I was not any hardcore player or anything like that, it's also really cool to kind of go back and re-experience some things with a lot more knowledge than I had back then when I was a total noob. But it also really brought me to recognizing that Spirit had returned. Spirit, of course, MP5, mana regen, whatever you really want to call it, was a stat that you're having in both Cataclysm and Mists of Pandaria that really just got phased out entering into Warlords of Draenor, where you were able to adjust and fine-tune the mana regen you were getting. And it brought forth a lot of really good structure, I think, for healing in general. And with all of our talk and all of our conversation about how to fix healing, and they could do this, they could do that, honestly, I think they could also explore bringing back Spirit as a stat, and it would have really good benefits, I think, for both what Raiders want today and what Mythic Plus runners want today. What do I mean by that? Well, and Plusers, you guys have realized how frustrating it is when crazy amounts of burst damage are going out and you're really struggling to have the resources to push up those health pools. With all of the health increases that we received in Dragonflight, followed by damage increases, it made it harder for you to top off health bars. And as a result, these changes were so focused on, making raiding a little bit more palatable and not too overly bursty, that you kind of just had this disconnect in raids and Mythic Plus at the same time. So how would Spirit actually help that out? Well, one of the nice things with Spirit is that it also led to certain abilities being high mana cost but high power, while also having low mana cost abilities that were low power. For Disc Priest in Cataclysm, for example, your atonement healing was smart healing, and it wasn't healing for like the massive amounts, the 60-70% you see in live servers today. It was just efficient healing per mana cost. And so your ability to add damage was helpful for the group, but it was also just the efficient way that you healed when not much was going on. But if you needed to push up health pools really quickly, you could do so at the expense of your mana. Well, what would that mean for a Mythic Plus environment? Well, you probably wouldn't want to actually spec into Spirit, so what good is it, right? Well, it mainly is going to be providing a sort of check on how much burst output and how much you can spam your buttons. Because if you're in an emergency, you'll then have those resources on hand. Having, a couple Prayer of Healing casts that you can actually utilize, or Radiance casts you can utilize, but at large expense to your mana. So you are going to have to drink in between pulls, which isn't too different than I'd say most specs have had to deal with over the course of their Mythic Plus adventures. But there's also going to be the option to be able to spec into more Spirit if you needed to for those long-standing encounters. It also would mean you'd have to be a little wiser with your resources, and so good healers would be ones going less frequently because they'd be finding good ways to be able to utilize their resources to be as efficient as they possibly can. And it also has the really big upside from a rating perspective to sort of slow down things without having to have a hard disconnect between raid healing and M+ healing. A previous video I said I think that they should really have a healing increase when you're in a 5-man environment and then just sort of lower output in a raid, so that way it takes longer to top off in a raid when you have multiple healers, and healers in a solo environment in a dungeon are able to still push up health bars on their own. That could still work, but Spirit can also accomplish that same goal where you are speccing into more Spirit in a raiding environment, thus lowering your output because you're not having as many secondary stats like crit or mastery or whatever. And then in a key environment, you are taking on as little Spirit as you could, but you are then drinking in between pulls, or you might spec into a little bit of Spirit for a really difficult and long boss encounter like Khajiit or something in Halls of Infusion to be able to make up for that. It also would sort of adjust your gameplay so that you have a little bit less pressure to be adding as much damage when you are taking slower ways to sort of top off health bars. It's kind of tempting in this world that we're in Mythic Plus, where you want to push up health bars as fast as you can, and then you're getting pressure to add more damage in this downtime. Well, if you're taking a longer time to push up health bars, then you're also having less activity time that could be dedicated to damage, and as a result, the sort of expectations for the group around you is more on a good M+ healer is the one that's not going rather than, a good M+ healer is the one that's doing all this damage, like you'll frequently see out of the Pug environment today. Now, there were some problems with Spirit back in Kata and mainly Mists of Pandaria from a lot of my memories, and that were some things that sort of broke the rules. If we just have this general structure of saying, hey, if you want to have more mana regen, you're going to need to spec into more spirit, whether that's gems or enchants or just the gear drops themselves. Could be a positive for having gear drops that have spirit on them, because then that means healers actually get some loot. But I don't think they're going to bring back things like reforging. I think they're pretty much just dead. So what do I mean by like breaking the rules? Well, there's a few different abilities in the game that are circumventing, navigating around the rules that Spirit brings. Things like Innervates, external mana resources, like the mana regen you get out of like source magic. I know it's not a lot, but just as an example, being able to give other resources to people to be able to increase their regen so that they can last harder. I think having something like Innervate as a personal only ability and not having the other druid specs outside of Resto having access to it, making it a Resto only, personal only type ability, is a good way to make sure that the sort of like walled garden of spirit and mana balancing doesn't really get disturbed. We've seen times in the past where like Mistweaver monks have had some insane value out of like Mana Tea, and their health bars are just zipping up and down like crazy. That spec in particular has an amazing capability of turning excess mana into giga large amounts of output. Having spirit and sort of adjusting the base, like the 0 level of regen, is going to be like super important for them to actively manage, so that there's not having these specs getting way out of control. The other benefit is Holy Paladin mains, even Preservation Evokers, I think, as well for raids, have had these moments where you're kind of just hitting your buttons on cooldown naturally and you're just going right? And I think Spirit's another really good way that they can start adjusting certain specs that don't really have as much of a mana dump. Paladin in particular, we don't really have as much of a mana dump as you might see out of other healers, and allow them to say, hey, well, you're a healer that isn't really dependent on your spirit. You need around this level to do this well in this fight, and then you're going to be set. Whereas other healers might have to spec really heavily into that spirit and make their sort of adjustments accordingly. I think this could be really, really helpful. And they also have to make sure they don't do the other thing that Cataclysm did, which also broke the rules, which was intellect increasing mana. Back in the day, you got to a point where if you just had enough intellect, your mana bar just got larger. Like, you just had a larger mana pool to work with. And so if you had enough mana, you didn't really care about your mana regen, because you just have enough in your base pool to get you over the hump into the next boss fight, or get you through that boss fight. They really got to make sure they don't do things like that. Our history really that we had a lot of times with Spirit was that beginning of expansions, it was really important to be able to have enough of a spirit pool to work with to get you through these encounters, spirit gems, enchants, whatever, to make sure that you would be able to heal through those encounters. And then as you got stronger over time, that was the area where you started sort of speccing out of it. The challenge that really existed in Mist of Pandaria was that they didn't really scale up health pools enough with the power that we were getting. And so when you naturally hit that point where you're speccing out of spirit late in the expansion, the healer strength was just absolutely absurd, and the damage was so insanely bursty. And they were sort of fine with that because you had large absorb healers with Disc Priest, and even Holy Pally had a ton of did you know about that? They had a ton of absorbs back in Mist of Pandaria. And so they're like, oh, well, we have these absorb healers that can make it so your raid survives the damage. That's going to be fine, right? And as a result, they were sort of just allowing that massive burst and one-shotty raid potential to exist. So if they were actually going to do Spirit correctly, they would have to stop these rule breakings of not having intellect increase mana, which it doesn't already, which is good. Not having external mana resources like Innervate that you can just start to funnel power into certain specs. I think that would be fantastic. I think things like Symbol and Mana Tide would actually get better value just in general, which would be great to be able to see. A lot of times Symbol is sort of brought for the cooldown reduction that it brings to defensives, rather than the mana regen. It's nice, but it's far from the primary reason. It also make it so that mana is a real mechanic to be able to manage in a raid, which would mean that it's going to be particularly important to work with the other healers as a cohesive team, to not just have everyone blasting their highest output abilities constantly every single moment and then just going into 40-50% overheal territory. When you actually have to pace your healing, one, you're spending more time actively healing rather than just pushing up health bars and waiting for the next burst of damage, but you're also working more in conjunction with the team itself to say, hey, this person has a raid cooldown going. I don't need to be burning any expensive and high output abilities in this moment, because I can just let this heal and I can just heal efficiently and put out output that is not going to be draining my mana in the process. I think this could be a really interesting way of sort of adding it back into the table, but there are a couple like little problems that are sort of snaking their way through that they'd actually have to address more so on like the per spec basis, like I mentioned with things like Innervate and Mana Tea. So if you want to running some of the benefits of bringing Spirit back into the game, having Spirit on gear would actually mean healers get loot for one thing. It would mean that you'd actually be judged on how well and how efficient you're healing, giving a little bit more weight to overhealing these days, which doesn't really seem to have too much of a weight at all. It makes mana matter, but it also makes it customizable. And if they do it properly, it's not something that you're able to cheat with. You're not able to just get Innervate stacked. You're not just able to get all these external mana resources to have your life easier. It actually makes mana as a resource that you have to be playing around, and in the process of playing around it, it also means that you're spending more time healing, and healing in different ways. Not let me bum rush health pools up to full as fast as I possibly can, and that's the only thing I need to worry about, but how can you have a lot more longevity to your healing to be able to sustain allies through that heavy damage. When I was playing through Cataclysm and like watching some old VODs of people raiding and everything back in the day, it's staggering to be able to see how much slower the gameplay is, but also the decision making. Just because health pools take a little bit longer to be able to be pushed up doesn't mean that healers are doing nothing. It's that they're making decisions based on the efficiency of their output and the efficiency of their spells. I don't think we need to go back to having 50 different abilities and having flash heal, greater heal, binding heal, you know, all of that. We don't need to have bloat in our abilities to have like, this is strong, this is weak. But I think that having a bit more mana cost to like high AoE abilities and making sure that there's sort of like an efficient single target option for everybody to be able to push up those health pools when they want to play more efficiently, or when you realize that, you know, things like Leech are going to be able to bring up health pools, then you can sort of just DPS during downtime or heal efficiently during that downtime to save yourself mana so that you're not in as much of a rush. I think most people can agree that healing is just fast, bursty, and it's more about being able to like preempt whether it's individuals' defensives or whether it's, you know, your preparatory output of just pushing up those health bars as fast as they can, even if it means that you're overhealing or wasting mana or wasting resources to be able to do it. And one of the solutions, or pretty much the main solution, is to be able to slow the game down in different ways that are also going to be interesting for you to work with. Being able to customize your resources and being able to better set yourself up for success in different ways, in different environments, and adding a little bit more of like the macro thought to it for how your stats look and for how, you know, your talents and your healing style might look depending on how much mana regen you have, I think could be really cool. It would really require some time and attention as it grows over the course of the expansion, because as we've seen, healer power and the ability to push up health pools can be extremely crazy at times, especially with all the other talents and resources that we get throughout an expansion. But let me know what you guys think. If you'd like to see Spirit return, or if you absolutely hate it, let me know. Be sure to give a thumbs up to the video and subscribe for more of these kind of content. And be sure to keep it here for more War Within Alpha coverage. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Hope you all enjoyed it, and I'll catch y'all next time.